Hello. If you've accessed this video, you must be looking for help on how to write a villanelle, which is another of those items from the personal anthology that you need to complete. The draft due date for this assignment is November 21st. Please remember that the rough draft is worth 10 points of the total 30 your final draft will earn. So it's important, again, that you meet the draft due date. We've already had some discussion in class about the villanelle. So for most of you, this presentation is a recap of that discussion. And the first question everybody had in class was, what is a villanelle? Simply put, it's a poem with a set number of lines and a regular pattern of rhyme. Now that's not necessarily what you see when you read modern poetry. Most of what you read today, both online and in books, is called free verse. But historically, a poem wasn't recognized as a poem unless it followed a particular structure. Shakespeare's sonnets, for example, are 14 lines long. Each word at the end of a line rhymes with another in a regular pattern, and a rhyming couplet ends the poem. Of course, most people were illiterate until the late 19th century, so kings and noblemen are the ones who read and wrote poetry, which made it a pretty exclusive art form. That's why a true poem had to follow a prescribed form to be considered legitimate. With all that being said, poetry was then and is still about wordplay. The ability to use words creatively within a set structure is a skill we still admire today. Think of Eminem, Lil Wayne, and Iggy Azalea. Rap has a set structure, and using words effectively are what made those people successful as rappers. In its current structure, a villanelle has been around since the late 1800s and was popularized by a Frenchman named Theodore de Banville. Basically, a villanelle is 19 lines long, with some variation on the length of the lines, but always repeating two particular lines in a regular pattern we'll get to shortly. The 19 lines are made up of 5 stanzas called tercettes, and 1 stanza known as a quatrain. Some heavy-duty contemporary poets practiced the villanelle form. In fact, among them Seamus Heaney and Sylvia Plath, who will study second semester. Oh, and you, because you are going to write one as well. Getting back to those 19 lines though, remember I said that a villanelle contains 5 tercettes and a quatrain. Traditionally, those tercettes were written in iambic pentameter, which you should remember from your reading of Romeo and Juliet last spring. I'm not, however, going to ask you to compose in iambic pentameter, although your lines must be 10 to 11 syllables long to meet the project requirements. Those 5 tercettes will give you a total of 15 lines, and the quatrain, the last stanza of the poem, in 4 lines, gives you the needed 19 total. And even though we're going to ignore meter in this villanelle, you'll need a regular pattern of rhyme, though we're going to keep that really simple with an ABA structure. That'll make it easier. Now, I can see the anxiety in your faces. And before you completely melt down and start screaming yourselves, let's look at what this would look like on the page. Here's a really simple to understand villanelle written by Joan Graham, with the rhyme scheme illustrated for you in parentheses at the end of each line. Is there a villain in your villanelle? Just lurking, smirking in a line or two? Read on, my dear, for only time will tell. He'll try to show that you can't really spell, or hold a poem together without glue. Is there a villain in your villanelle? And what if you can't rhyme things very well? Perhaps it is a plot by you-know-who. Read on, my dear, for only time will tell. If all those rhythmic feet were tripped and fell, you might consider what is plaguing you. Is there a villain in your villanelle? But wait a minute, you are doing swell. You've written something lively, something new. Read on, my dear, for only time will tell. You're almost through now, you can give a yell. You've finished just what you set out to do. Is there a villain in your villanelle? Read on, my dear, for only time will tell. Now that you should have recognized in the reading in this poem, in addition to the end rhyme, is the repetition of 2 particular lines of the poem. those lines both appear in the first and last stanzas together and alternate where they appear in the rest of the poem. So let's take a closer look again at what this poem is actually doing. Is there a villain in your villanelle is the first line of the poem, and it appears here in red to show where it is repeated. The first line of a villanelle then gets repeated as the 6th line, the 12th line, and the 18th line of the poem, respectively. 4 and 5 lines reflect the pattern of repetition of that first line, but then the 3rd line also gets repeated. The 9th line, here's the 3rd line, here's the 9th line, as the 15th line, as the 19th line, and that also has a regular pattern in that it is repeated every 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 there, and 1, 2, 3 in the last stanza. So there's a mathematical pattern here, and that's really what all of this is about. Again, it's about wordplay. And back in the day when they didn't have TV and all the other stuff we have to entertain ourselves, this is how people entertained themselves, by using words and creating patterns. So again, you shouldn't freak out about the requirement that you see here. Logically, if you think about it, the 1st and 3rd lines of the poem are each repeated 3 more times. So you really only need to come up with 10 other lines to complete your villanelle once you have the first stanza written. So we're talking about 10 lines other than those 2, because you're going to repeat them. So just to clarify, your villanelle, first of all, got to be 19 lines total. Those 19 lines will consist of 5 tercets and a quatrain. Line 1 will take up 4 lines of the total, showing up as the 1st line, the 6th line, the 12th line, and the 18th line. Line 3 will take up another 4 lines as line 3, line 9, line 15, and line 19. Each line must be 10 to 11 syllables long, and the rhyme scheme must be ABA for the tercets, with the quatrain adding 1 extra rhyme for an ABAA pattern. Here's another example of a villanelle written by a Welsh poet named Dylan Thomas. It happens to be one of the most famous examples of the structure, and in it the narrator is trying to motivate his elderly father, who the narrator believes is too accepting of his impending death. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now, with your fierce tears I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So obviously this poem is much more serious in its subject matter, but the structure is also the same. First line is here, repeated as the 6th line, the 12th line, and the 18th line, and then that 3rd line of the first stanza is repeated here at the 9th line, at the 15th line, and then again at the 19th line. Now once your villanelle is drafted, you're going to simply title it with the number of the panel from the Jacob Lawrence Migration series that inspired the poem. Remember, that's the whole point of this. If that was panel 19, then the title of your villanelle will be panel 19. Everyone's title will be the same except for the number at the end of the panel. If the panel you used was panel 31, then that will be your title, panel 31. If it was 3, your title will be panel 3, and so on. And don't forget to cite. The panel you used to write your poem was not your work, so you need to give credit to Jacob Lawrence on your works cited page. Copy and pasting the EasyBib citation in the alphabetical position where it belongs. Finally, remember that poetry is about wordplay. So play and have fun.